Okay, welcome to this evening's Bible class, and if you'll turn with me to Mark chapter 13. We're going to begin at the new paragraph that begins at verse 41 of Mark 13, verse 41. This is a stark contrast. Mark has recorded those words that we left off with this morning about the religious elites. Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, the top of my page says 13, but it's Mark 12. Yeah, that's right. I got so much junk on my page that sometimes I obscure the chapter divisions. Yes, it's Mark 12 and verse 41. The language that we concluded with this morning was the warning that Jesus made to the people that were surrounding, the people that made up the audience, beware of the scribes. And that would almost be the same as beware of the Pharisees, because the scribes mostly were what? Members of the Pharisee sect, which loved to go in long clothing, loved salutations in the marketplaces, loved the chief seats in the synagogues, and loved the uppermost rooms at the feast, which they devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. These shall receive greater damnation. Anybody have a comment on that expression, greater damnation, or do we have another version that has different wording? How about Ashley? The very last words of verse 40.
There's another verse that probably maybe tie in there where it starts saying that those that know the world receive with many stripes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that it has to do with the individual knowing to do better, knowing what was right, and because of conscience, and they just refuse to do or go against what they know to be the right way. And so I think it has more to do with self. But it's a little bit different when a person doesn't know and they go about blindly doing things wrong. But when a person knows it's like an extra guilt laid upon that person or something.
That certainly fits the context. It said that they devoured widows' houses, and then they turned around and did what? Went in these long prayers, the ostentation. So that certainly, what does yours have to say?
Yet they shamelessly cheat widows out of their property and then pretend to be pious by making long prayers in public. Because of this, they will be more severely punished. And that reminded me too with the verse about communion, about drinking damnation to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You know what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then you come in and act like everything's good.
Yeah.
It's more. I don't know if it's a severe punishment from God or that it's the same punishment, but you're feeling it more because you know that you could have done better and you knew. So I just kind of wonder if it's like a self.
Oh, I connect that to our passage this morning about the mourning, the tribes of the earth mourning and the kings of the earth mourning. Those people that would have that severe prick of conscience because of them having, right. I mean, these are the keepers of the law, and here what are they doing? They're using their position with the law to steal widows' houses, and then for a pretense they get out and make these real long prayers. People say, "Oh, how pious these people are." Yes, Jimmy.
With the understanding that there's no hell, then what is this referring to?
Well, I think because separation from God is separation from God. It doesn't make any difference whether you're a sinner on the streets of Arcadia or you're Adolf Hitler. Right. Yeah, you're right. I mean, the worst thing that can happen is that there be no recollection of anybody of anything, as your whole existence was just an absolute waste. That's what I get from that eternal separation from God. And I think Ashley hit it. I think that the greater condemnation comes from the prick of your own conscience. When these people are doing everything they can to denigrate Christ, and there will be a day coming when the things that Christ has predicted, prophesied, are going to come true, and those people will hurt worse than anyone else. Yes, Keith.
I think we look at that from our standpoint, but we should keep it in context of them being under the law still. Jesus taught about Lazarus and the rich man. The rich man woke up, his eyes in hell, and he could remember the things that were that he did or he left undone in his previous life.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it seems like because he was able to remember those things, it became more of a torturous thing. I don't want to say torturous thing, but more of a sin-bearing thing.
Yeah, well, in that example from Luke 15, I mean, certainly the rich man, he's in a real burden of heart. I mean, he speaks of his own torment, but then he's tormented by the fact that he has this other family that they're living the same life that he lived, and he knows that this is going to be their place. So I think Ashley hit the nail on the head in my mind. All right, so anyway, that's a stark contrast from what we have that beginning in verse 41. I'm sorry, Lonnie, did you have a comment?
No.
Okay. Okay. And Jesus sat over against the treasury. Over against is an expression that just means in the same area of the treasury where money was deposited. This would be money that is a free will offering for support of the temple. And beheld how the people cast money into the treasury. And many that were rich cast in much. And there came a certain poor widow, and she threw in 2 mites, which make a farthing. Now these are old Elizabethan English money weights, but I think we can get the gist of it even if we don't know the values. It takes 2 mites to make 1 farthing, and the implication is that 1 farthing is a very, very small amount, so 2 mites is even less. But what's interesting is Jesus' observation of this. He called unto his disciples and saith unto them, Verily I say unto you that this poor widow hath cast more in than all they, that is the rich, previously mentioned, have cast into the treasury, for all they did cast in of their abundance. But she of her want did cast in all that she had, even all her living. And so as Jesus makes this observation, you have these people putting in the money, and the wealthy people, they put in a lot of money, but then they do what? They also have an awful lot to continue living with, whereas this woman, it's not what she gave, it's how she gave. She was totally dependent on God. She was going to give and then depend on God for her sustenance, her daily maintenance. And again, this is in stark contrast to these wealthy religious leaders that were just mentioned. And so what Mark is doing is drawing and making a comparison here. Yeah. Anybody have things that they want to mention? I think if there's a principle here, it's to understand that our life in Christ is to be a living sacrifice, a living faith, and not one. It's one that's done quietly and for the most part. I mean, obviously not everything can be, but not be like those that are doing everything they can to garner the look-see of yeah, right. Selfishness. Yes, Keith.
Yeah, I think this is why. This is my observation of why. When Jesus said about the rich, it is hard for a rich man to enter into heaven. Because we all know, because of the things that he has there where his heart is. In this country, it is very, in my observation, it's hard for us to be as dedicated to God as we should be, because of, and it's ironic because of the blessings that God blessed us with. Because our hearts sometimes are centered upon the things that we have, the things that and actually that God's blessed us with, and we put more emphasis on those things than we do on God, and it's hard. It's a hard lesson to teach, a hard lesson for us to learn, to separate the things, the physical things that God blesses us with having the right attitude and how we serve God and how we give and depend upon God. States, we are very rich in this country. Compared to other countries, we are very, very rich. And we don't mind coming to church and sometimes throwing in money into the offering. But are we doing it for the right reason? Are we giving as we should? Are we giving with the right attitude towards God? That's something we all always check, always be concerned about, because we might be going through the motions just as these people were. They had great songs. They gave great sums of money. But it was because they had great sums of money to depend upon. So they really wasn't depending on God.
They left a lot, but they also kept a lot. You know what? This just comes to mind if we stop and think about it. If prior generations could see us and look at what we consider to be a necessity, which to them would have just, yeah. If sometimes you watch television programs, from prior generations, and you see how starkly furnished, their homes are, and simple lifestyles, and if we try to consider how would we, I'm over at your house today, and even the smallest little child has a cell phone, I mean, the things, how societal things have changed, When I was that little, if we had 2 Dixie cups and a string. Yeah. Lonnie, you had an observation, sir?
I was thinking about these people that was casting in the money and never dealt with how much they put in, or that they put in like they should be. Just that he watched them, but he did come on what the big did. She put in all she had, in a sense. But idea maybe it was doing what they supposed to do, or they wasn't. But they only was. I believe they were putting in just a percentage, not even a tenth of it, because under the law, this is what they had to do. But this lady had put all of her things she had, everything she had. So it was more than a tenth. It was all she had.
You can go to the extreme too, and take from this that God wants you to give everything, but that's not true either. Because if you were to totally empty yourself, then you would have nothing less to either help yourself or even help somebody else. But I think, again, we look at the principles involved, and I think it's a self-examination. I'm grateful that, my son James, I don't think he has ever said a prayer at the dinner table where he doesn't ask God to bless those that are less fortunate than ourselves. And I think that's an attitude that we just always, need to take. And I know James, he's a generous kid, and so he lives it. So certainly something. Yes.
I had a comment in my Bible that said, as believers, we should consider increasing our giving, whether of money, time, or talent, to a point beyond convenience or calculation.
Yeah, beyond convenience. Yeah.
I go back to, I think when she read that, I think about David. David said, I will not give the Lord anything. I'm paraphrasing now. Go back and read it for yourself. Find it. But I won't give the Lord anything that didn't cost me something.
Yeah.
So,
right.
When we think about giving, and we talk about giving to God, does it cost you anything? Does it hurt? A little hurt? A little something that you give to the Lord, does it cost you a little bit inconvenience or whatever? And David said, I won't give the Lord anything that didn't cost me anything, so because I want to give, and it means something.
I'm glad you brought that out. That's a real interesting point. It's from 2 Samuel chapter 24. David took a census, took account of the Jewish people for the purpose of, I think it was for building an army. And God did not want him to do it. God wanted him to depend on God. And David took this census, and as a result, and God did something to the people. Beginning of verse 17 of 2 Samuel 24, David spake unto the Lord when he saw the angel that smote the people. You said it was a plague. I haven't read before that. It's been a while since I've read this text. And said, Lo, I have sinned. I have done wickedly. But these sheep, and of course he means sheep figuratively, speaking of, the peak of the people, the Jews, what have they done? Let thine hand, I pray thee, be against me and against my father's house. And Gad came that day to David I'm not sure who the character Gad is in this, but he must be some authority. Gad came that day to David and said to him, "Go up, rear, build an altar unto the Lord in the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite." I have a little note here that I find I wrote by hand. I have no idea when I wrote this. This threshing floor of Araunah would later become the site of Solomon's temple. Interesting note. And David, according to the saying of Gad, went up as the Lord commanded, and Araunah looked and saw the king and his servants coming on towards him, and Araunah went out and bowed himself before the king on his face upon the ground. And Araunah said, "Wherefore is my lord the king come unto his servant?" And David said, "To buy the threshing floor of thee, to build an altar unto the Lord, that the plague may be stayed." Thank you for remembering it was a plague. And Araunah said unto David, "Let my lord the king take and offer up what seemeth good unto him. Behold, here be oxen for burnt sacrifices, threshing instruments, and other instruments of wood for the oxen." So if you get the picture, David is saying that he's been commanded to build an altar to the Lord, and on Araunah's site. And Araunah says, to him, "Here, you don't have to buy it. Just take it, and even take the animals for the offering." All these things did Araunah as a king give unto the king David. And Araunah said unto the king, "The Lord thy God accept thee." And the king said unto Araunah, No, but I will surely buy it of thee at a price. Neither will I offer burnt offerings unto the Lord my God of that which doth cost me nothing. See, so if we think somehow that we're given to God just because we have something that maybe somebody else bequeathed to us, that's the principle here, So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver, and David built there an altar unto the Lord and offered these burnt offerings and peace offerings. So the Lord was entreated for the land. In other words, God was satisfied. And the plague was stayed from Israel. So there's a perfect example of the things that we're saying. David knew that the people were punished as a result of his sin. He's commanded to build this altar. The man who owns the ground says, "I'll just give these things to you, even give you the animals." And David says, "No, I can't give to the Lord that which it's not. You might give it to me, but then if I turn around and use it, then it's not really coming from any sacrifice on my part."
That's the same attitude to Abraham when he wanted to buy the field that was dead.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Sometimes people do things that's been favor later. Sometimes it's wise, the person want to give you something to wear.
Right.
I'll pay you for it. That's what they would do. Because people come back and want you to do something.
Yeah, you never want to inhibit anybody from their offer of generosity. And it's like you say, I think there's times where you kind of weigh out the situation, and you might see where somebody does want to do something very generous for you, and then it's better for you to say no, because, like you say, there may be some string attached later, and for the freedom of conscience that it was your effort, you refused their offering. I would say you should never do it without doing what? How about explaining the reason why? Yeah, so that they know what the reason would be. I think that's what David did to Araunah. He said, "No, I can't offer to God something that doesn't cost me anything."
But this was the nature of being forgiven of any sin under the Old Testament. When a person sinned, they were supposed to go to their farm and take of an offering that had no blemish, no spot, a perfect offering for their sin.
That's a good observation. Without it being said there, and he's at.
They had to go to some place that had one and purchase that because it was for their sin. For the individuals and the families that had sinned, it had to cost them something. And we look at it, we look at the sheep and the goats and all that being sacrificed, but the fact was it had to cost that person something.
Right.
Because of the sin. So,
Right. The Jews were to take of their own flock, and if they didn't have a flock, then they were to secure it financially. Yes, sir.
There are also cases where people couldn't afford it. bring a dove or something
Mhm.
like that.
Right.
They're going to probably catch one of those
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
something, bring it.
Right.
It's always some kind of thing in God's plan here
Mhm.
for a person.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Joseph and Mary, I think, in one of their offerings, they didn't have the animal, and so that they had turtle doves or something. Yeah, yeah. Okay, chapter 13 begins like this, and as he, Jesus, went out of the temple, one of his disciples saith to him, Master, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here. Now, when I gave you this last week, I gave this so that we can kind of use it as a study guide where we're going to try to harmonize each of these. And when in my study of this, I saw here, that in Matthew chapter 23, which is next down, it says that Jesus' rebuke of the Pharisees, and that comes in Matthew chapter 23 as an extended version of what we have just been studying. So rather than going to chapter 13, we'll come back to chapter 13 because that's Mark's rendition of the Mount of Olives discourse. Okay, so if you'll go with me to Matthew chapter 23. Yes, sir. Oh, that's right. You were not here, John. Yes. So just make that on your observation there. That's kind of a rough outline of where we are in our harmony, and each one of those takes us up, except for John. Each one of them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, take us up to the. Yeah. Yes. Matthew, Mark, and Luke take you up to the arrest in our harmony, and John. In the same chapter as the arrest, we also have the mock trials that begin in John. But let's go to Matthew chapter 23, which is a text that we get a lot of information on because it builds, again, Matthew is writing to the Jews, so we have a lot of Jewish elements in Matthew that we don't have in particularly Mark and Luke that are writing to a Gentile audience. And that's not to say or take away from what Luke and Mark write, particularly because there's information sometimes that they put in a text that we don't have in others. And so, it goes to what we said before. If you want to know everything you can about a particular subject in the Bible, you go to every place where you have words that pertain to that particular thing. And so that's why we're going to go to Matthew chapter 23. And you'll recognize this, not just because it's familiar text, but also too as what we have just come off in Mark chapter 12. And then spake Jesus to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. I think Keith brought up this particular text this morning. In that sense is that when you remember our passage this morning that we took out of the book of Numbers, the Lord God spake unto Moses, saying, and that's a refrain that's repeated over and over. Well, it was because Moses was God's man. He went to the Jewish people, and so then after Moses was left, we have other Jewish leaders that rise, and these so-called lawyers and scribes. We would understand there's certainly a dutiful and respectful occupation being a scribe. To do what? Yes, right. You have to keep writing the text so that every synagogue has a copy of Moses and the law. They didn't have anything else at that particular time. They just had Moses and the law. And it was real important that this would be used within the synagogue for the reading and for the studying and for people to come to a knowledge of what was required of them under the law. That we'd have to say from that there's certainly a purpose for religious leaders. Now, I don't know that it was ever in God's intents or plans and purpose that he would have Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and all these other pseudo-political within the religion. But certainly if they'd have been doing their job, if they had been shepherding the people as they should have been, then the people wouldn't have been destitute. And when I say destitute, in the sense not that they were hungry or that they were impoverished in so much as they were destitute of the Word of God. Just a second. Lonnie? Yes, sir?
I said, yeah, when you study it, there was more group beside them. There
Mhm.
seems and other ones.
Yeah.
There was more group there. They had separated themselves because of what was going on at the time with the heads, those that were been teaching the people.
Yeah, they were probably the kinship with people today, in religious bodies. If you disagree with somebody, you just go out and start another one, I'm saying that. I say that tongue in cheek. You know.
I don't think these people had any evil intent when they did these
Mhm.
things.
Right.
They were
I understand.
because they were adulterating the truth, what was being taught. Because these people that like their seed, they went out and they copied the Bible, and they might have been doing what the Bible said do. I don't know. Because I don't know whether they went down to the temple every 2 years, or two times a year, I think it was. All males had to be there. So I don't know that much. A lot of things we don't know about what's going on.
Yeah, I'm sure that somewhere there's a good record, and there may be. You've read all of Josephus. I don't know if you see that the evolution of these pseudo-political groups within the religion. Does Josephus address that? Yeah, probably in his Antiquities section of there. But yeah, I think Lonnie's probably right. There probably wasn't anything ulterior in those people coming and grouping together. But like in so many other cases, you have things that evolve over themselves, and then they kind of lose sight of what was the intended purpose to begin with. But Jesus, it says he's speaking to the multitude and to his disciples. And if you've read this text before, which I'm sure you have, because again, this is a passage that we quote from a lot, he's going to direct his words towards the Pharisees later, but right now he's talking to the multitudes and the disciples, and we find that he's in the temple area. We find that in Mark chapter 12. It states specifically that he's in the area of the temple, and so you have the swelling of the population of Jerusalem at this particular time. This is Passover week, and now we're a few days since the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and that Jesus spends an awful lot of his time in the temple area where he's teaching, and he's teaching boldly because, don't you know that he knows, he said, let us go to Jerusalem. I think that's Luke 18:31. Let us go to Jerusalem where all things will be what? Fulfilled, accomplished. So he knows what he's facing towards the end of this week. You talk about stress and anguish. If ever the fleshly part of Jesus was under stress and anguish, we know that and a day or two later when he's praying in the garden, the intensity of his prayer causes the vessels in his forehead to burst just from the stress, and it mixes with the perspiration, and it appears as if he's sweat drops of blood, I think is what the text says. Yes, sir.
I was going to say, that's why, during the sound, that's why he didn't answer the question people was asking him, because it wasn't time yet. He evaded them. And so later on, he do, in a sense, answer when they did him, that it was that time for him to go.
Yeah, that's a good point. In the harmony that we have been over the last quite a few months, right? We have many, many times where Jesus will resist something because said, my time is not yet come, right? You remember in John 2, when we first started this, Mary comes to Jesus and says, hey, the wedding guests, they've run out of wine, and Jesus' response to her is my time is not yet come. And then that's repeated a number of times. Well, now his time is come, and I think that's part of the reason that he was this entrapment, because they know Jesus to be so bold. And the language that we had from the earlier verses, we reflected back on him this morning in the earlier part of chapter 12, that we know that you have no consideration of others. In other words, we know that you're going to speak boldly, and they're hoping that in that boldness that he would say something that they could find a reason to arrest him. Really, when it comes down to it, the only reason they could arrest him would be for what? Yeah, on the Jewish side for blaspheming, and then on the Roman side for some type of insurrection, right? Like don't pay the tax.
And then if he said he was a king, and stuff like that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, some form of insurrection. And of course, that's kind of, whereas Jesus makes these references, of course, eventually where they're going to get him, well, he called himself God, or the same as God. All right, so right now he's speaking to the multitude and his disciples, saying the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. And therefore, I guess you can say he's really kind of recognizing that they do have a place, in religion. They sit in Moses' seat. Okay, so, and he says, all therefore whatsoever they bid you to do, Johnny quoted this morning, you listen to what it is that they say, and that you can observe for the purpose of doing it. But do not you after their works, for they what? They say, and they do not. And then he expresses what he means here in the next verse. For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. And so he's speaking here is that these people, again, their authority has gone to their head. They have ingratiated themselves with power and influence, and even financially at the expense of the people. And then they turn around and they bind severe terms on the people. And a lot of times it doesn't really have anything much or if anything to do with the law. It comes from what? The traditions of the elders, right? That they have over a period of time. It's kind of like Lonnie said a while ago. There may not have been any ill intentions when they first formed these groups, but over time, just like we see in society and civil groups and things, that something that you plan is good in and of itself, and then plans go awry because other people begin to influence that, and it takes on a different complexion, a different picture of what it was in its original and real intent. And I think that's kind of what we have in Phariseeism. Jesus said, they sit in Moses' seat, so they do speak with some level of authority. And there is some measure of what they say. It has got to be good and valuable for the people. And I want you to listen to those things for the purpose of being able to discern, fret out, and then do what it is that you find that you're responsible for doing. But don't do as they say, because they say and do not. And it says you bind the heavy burdens. You're talking about the weight of something, but they themselves will not what? Right. He uses this expression, little finger, which is a figurative expression. They won't put any more on that than what the little finger can pick up. Yes, Ashley?
No, I'm just thinking, when you think of it like that, it's like y'all couldn't handle what God gave you to do, but now you're going to add more stuff on top of it. Of course, you're not going to ever be able to,
Yeah. Who is it? Is it Nicodemus or Gamaliel that makes a statement that chastises the Pharisees? You're binding things on people which you yourselves would not even do. I can't remember where the context of that was. It? Uh-huh. Oh yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, I remember. Yeah, that was right. Yeah, that's the Jerusalem conference in Acts 15. Yes, sir.
I don't know that these individuals with these different religious affiliations or whatever, had in mind anything wrong when they started creating, but the very fact that they created those things was an affront to God. Because God people was always supposed to be together.
There's probably some truth to that, right? So there's probably some truth to that. Yeah.
We can speculate that they didn't, but the very fact that they had a division. And that one felt that they had to start another because they couldn't agree with this one, and because they thought they were right and this one was wrong. There was a division there, and that went against God. And so the whole, what you call political society thing, the whole thing was wrong. And we can look at today why we have so many denominations today, because one thought the other one was wrong, wasn't teaching the truth, so they started their own sect. So then someone out of that sect felt that they were wrong, they weren't teaching the truth, so they started another sect. So, so all these things were wrong in the sight of God.
Sadly, we even see that in the Lord's church, right? I think I read something. There's just about 25 different. When you say you're a member of the Church of Christ, which Church of Christ are you? Which one are you, Lonnie? Excuse me.
Any religious leader that would teach something that is in a principle that the children of God is supposed to be mindful of and will not do it itself isn't worth standing there before God's people.
Right.
They're no good.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
We're missing the point of what these people were doing. The point is that we got to realize why the Roman church, number one, that they always say Roman, low C. The Roman church was just the church at Rome, and that was a part of the church, what we'll call started, all this different teaching, and then it get down to about the 4th century, then you see these different spirits come into action. So the Catholic Church, because it was the leader, that's where the power and authority was at Rome. That's why read so much about Rome, and that's why that church was taking the lead, because that's where they would be. These different churches, when they was telling different people to meet there, you know, and so they started bringing these different names and different titles of people, like a bishop, elder, and different things, which meant the same thing, but they started changing these different wording, and some of the church that was Church of Christ moved away from them. And so that's how some of this stuff got into action. Nothing is written by these other people that was still continuing in the faith. And so, and then later on, we don't study anything until about Luther. And Luther telling me, it was another guy had told him about something. Luther come on, and that's when Luther told us people not to call themselves Luther, but just say Christian.
Yeah, well, the evolution of church history obviously it's intense and it's very detailed. I think what we can do though is keep it within the context of 2,000 years ago with what it's saying right here.
Right. A person ain't wrong. A person is not wrong if they separate from somebody that is teaching something wrong and want to teach the truth. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah,
See, we make a mistake when we say a person is wrong when they do something like that.
I didn't make the mistake of anything. I'm going by what the Bible says. It's wrong in the sense that God never intended it.
No,
we can separate. Listen, we can separate for all the right reasons. All the things that we think that are right. We can separate from one another, but that's not God's intention.
That's right.
That has never been God's intention. It's always been. We quote it all the time that God have a people unto Himself,
Right.
and that doesn't mean that you believe one way, you believe that way, you believe this way. It means that we all believe the same way, believe the things that are taught in God's word.
And for these people in this particular context, that certainly is within the consequence of that particular time, because the law is still in effect. Right? Jesus, every breath that Jesus breathed, the law was still in effect. And so when Jesus gives some level of credibility to these people, the Pharisees, because they have some level of responsibility, whether it be right or wrong, Jesus is recognizing that they do exercise the law in place of Moses. And he's not saying that that in itself is wrong. What's wrong is the fact that they won't even do what they bind on others. And some of what they're binding, apparently there's some severity to it. Grievous, he calls it. And they won't even, and uses the illustration of the little finger. Ashley, you had a comment?
No, I was just going to add to what Dale said. That's applying to today. That's why it's so important that we have a spirit of humility and have an open mind.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when we're studying God's word, if somebody presents something to us that's different than what we have always known to be, that we take the time to hear what they have to say and examine the word, and just instantly, just shutting them out. Because a lot of that too, some people, it wasn't that they was wrong with what they believed, but when they tried to present it to the leadership or what have you, they blocked them out. And so it's like, do I stay and listen to this? They won't hear what I have to say or take the time to study with me. So
Yeah.
And so then they left. So you have to look at that part of it as well.
And I think that Daniel stated this masterfully the other day. There's a difference between the person that thinks that they know it all. And we've seen that ourselves. People that think, they're right. They don't even realize that their responsibility is to grow. From the time to the time you take your last breath, you need to be doing what? You need to be growing. You need to be passing up tomorrow where you are today. To grow in the grace and knowledge, not think that I have all truth, not think that the pathway to heaven's a line begins behind me, but as Daniel said, to realize that we are fallible. And that every time we hear something that's different, we need to open up our ears, pay attention, and see if it's something that we need to be listening to. Yes, Lonnie?
It's very important that we study these things about the church history, what was going on. And the church was at Rome, and was later called the Catholic Church. It was not called Catholic at that time. It was called the church at Rome, like the church, this place, church in Arcadia. That's what they were called.
Mhm.
Like it was, the word comes from seer, and all these different words, and they gave different meaning to them.
Mhm.
Like since I've been going to school in elementary all the way through, they have changed the meaning of a lot of words,
Mhm.
you know, and they give an extra meaning to it, and then they got to add it to the dictionary. And so this is what was going on. They started adding these different titles, which meant the same thing, but they gave them different positions in the church.
Yeah.
They
It-
had to do it.
right. It's what happens. Things, yeah.
That's what they call, what said the Pharisees, they tradition, they were holding on to tradition.
Right. It's not that they abandon everything totally, but that things begin to take on a different meaning over time. Well, let's draw our line there at chapter 5. Jaden, if you'll take care of that for us. And so if you'll be studying there, we'll probably spend a little bit of time in what did I say? Somebody told me this morning, verse 5, I'm sorry, verse 5.